The smoke alarm was still screaming when I realized my husband wasn't coming back for me. I remember the exact moment. Lying on the kitchen floor of our townhouse in Oakville. My left ankle twisted underneath me at a wrong angle, the air so thick with smoke that every breath felt like swallowing ash. Our son was upstairs, 7 years old, running a fever of 102 since the night before, too weak to get himself down the stairs. I could hear him coughing through the ceiling. I had been the one who smelled it first. Something electrical, sharp and bitter, coming from the basement. My husband had been in the living room with his laptop open, and I'd shaken his shoulder and said, "The basement smells wrong." And he'd said he'd check it. And then 30 seconds later, the smoke detector went off, and I was already at the bottom of the stairs, calling up to our son to stay low. I slipped on the last step. My ankle gave out and I went down hard on the tile, and the pain was immediate and blinding. I couldn't stand. I tried twice, and both times as my leg just folded. I was dragging myself toward the wall to pull myself up when the front door opened. Not the back door to the basement, the front door, and I heard my husband's voice outside, not calling for me, not calling for our son. He was talking to her, his colleague from work. She had come over that evening, supposedly to drop off documents, and she'd been in our living room for 40 minutes, while I was upstairs giving our son his second dose of children's Tylenol. I hadn't thought much of it. I was too tired to think much of anything. She was just there. And then the fire started. And then she was suddenly the only person my husband was thinking about. I found out later, from our neighbor, Mrs. Beaumont, who saw everything from her porch, that my husband had grabbed his colleague by the arm and rushed her outside the moment the alarm went off. He hadn't gone upstairs. He hadn't called out for our son. He'd just gotten her out, and then stood on the front lawn with her, and when Mrs. Beaumont asked him where his wife was, where was the little boy, he said he thought we'd gotten out the other way, he thought. I was on the floor for 11 minutes. I know because the fire investigator told me afterward, when I asked. 11 minutes of dragging myself to the base of the stairs and calling up to our son, telling him to stay on the floor, stay low, don't try to come down. His voice kept answering me, weak and scared but answering, and I held on to that. I kept talking to him. I told him about the time we drove to Niagara Falls when he was 4, and he was so convinced the mist was a cloud that had fallen down from the sky that he cried when we had to leave. I told him we were going to go back there. This summer, I told him. We'll go back this summer. The firefighters found us. One of them carried our son down. Another helped me outside. I sat on a stretcher in our driveway with a blanket around my shoulders and an oxygen mask over my face. And I watched my husband standing 20 feet away with his arm around his colleague. And I thought, I don't know who that man is. We had been married for 9 years. I should probably say something about who we were before all of this, because otherwise none of it makes sense. Or maybe it makes too much sense, and I just didn't want to see it. I met my husband when I was 26, working at a landscape architecture firm in downtown Hamilton. He was doing his MBA at McMaster. We met at a friend's housewarming in Westdale. He was funny and warm, and he had this way of listening to you that made you feel like whatever you were saying singins was the most interesting thing he'd heard all week. I fell in love with him fast, the way you do in your 20s when you haven't yet learned to check your own blind spots. We got married when I was 28. Our son was born 2 years later. My family had money. Not flashy money, but old, quiet, solid money. My father built a commercial real estate company over 40 years, and he did it carefully and without drama. When I was growing up, we lived in a nice house in Burlington and drove reasonable cars and took one good vacation a year. And my father always said that money was a tool, not a personality. I believed him. I still do. My husband came from a different background. His family had struggled. He'd put himself through school on a combination of loans and part-time work, and he was proud of that, and he should have been. But somewhere in the years after we got married, something shifted in him. The pride and hard work turned into something else. He got a senior position at a logistics firm in Mississauga, started making real money for the first time in his life. And I watched him change the way you watch weather come in across the lake, slowly, and then all at once. He bought a car I didn't know we were buying. He started taking clients to restaurants I had to look up to understand why the bill was what it was. He hired his colleague. Let me just call her what she was, because I knew, I'd known for months, the way you know something you're not ready to say out loud, as his executive assistant. And he started working late, and I told myself it was the job, it was the pressure, it was the new phase of his career. I told myself a lot of things. My father saw it before I did. He came for dinner in February, just a few weeks before the fire, and afterward he found me in the kitchen doing dishes, and he stood beside me for a minute without saying anything, and then he said, quietly, "Is everything okay, sweetheart?" And I said, "Yes, of course." Everything was fine. and he looked at me in a way that I understood. He was not asking about the dinner. I wish I had told him the truth that night. It would have saved me some of what came after. The hospital kept me for 2 days. Sprained ankle, smoke inhalation, minor burns on my right hand from where I'd braced against something hot without realizing it. Our son was treated and released the same night. The smoke exposure had been less upstairs, somehow, and the fever broke on its own the following morning. My mother drove up from Burlington and took him home with her, and I lay in my room at Oakville Trafalgar Memorial and stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what I was going to do. My husband visited once. The first evening, he brought flowers, grocery store flowers, still in the plastic sleeve, and he sat in the chair beside my bed and told me how frightening it had been, how he'd been in shock, how he hadn't been thinking clearly when he got outside. He said it in a tone I recognized. It was the tone of a man who had already decided which version of events he was going to stick to. I didn't argue with him. I looked at the flowers and I thought about Mrs. Beaumont watching him stand on the front lawn with his arm around another woman while his wife and son were still inside, and I said, "I need to rest," and he left. He didn't come back the second day. His colleague sent a card. An actual card, beige envelope, handwritten note inside saying she was so relieved I was okay and that it must have been terrifying. I put it face down on the bedside table and didn't touch it again. My father arrived the second morning. He didn't call ahead. I looked up and he was just there in the doorway. 71 years old, gray at the temples, still built like the man who used to coach my soccer team when I was 9. He had driven 4 hours from Ottawa, where he'd been for a board meeting, and he had a Tim Hortons cup in each hand and a look on his face that I recognized from childhood as meaning he had already assessed the situation and was ready to act. He sat down beside me and handed me a coffee and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the months of late nights, about his colleague, about the fire and the 11 minutes on the floor and the grocery store flowers. I talked for a long time. My father listened without interrupting, which is something he has always been exceptionally good at. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." Just that, "Okay." Then he took out his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to his lawyer in Toronto. The second was to my cousin, who is a forensic accountant. He looked at me when he was done and said, "You don't have to do anything right now except heal. I'm going to take care of the rest." I started to cry. Not because I was sad, exactly, or not only because I was sad, but because I had been carrying the weight of pretending everything was fine for so long, that having someone simply see it and say, "Okay," was more than I could hold without breaking open. The fire investigator's report came back 2 weeks later. Faulty wiring in the basement electrical panel. Not arson, not negligence on our part, just an old house with old wiring that had finally given out. The insurance company processed the claim. We were temporarily in a rental in Brampton while the repairs were assessed. I was on crutches. Our son was back in school, quieter than usual, but okay, asking every few days when we were going to go to Niagara Falls. My husband was behaving very carefully. He was home for dinners. He asked about my ankle. He helped with grocery runs and school pickups. And if I hadn't known what I knew, if I hadn't already spoken to my father's lawyer, if my cousin hadn't already started quietly reviewing the household finances, I might have let myself believe things were shifting back. He was performing the marriage so convincingly that there were moments I almost forgot what I was looking at. But I'd seen Mrs. Beaumont's face when she told me what she'd seen, and I'd heard the silence on the other end of the phone when I'd called his cell that second night in the hospital. And a woman's voice had answered before he grabbed it back and said the connection was bad. And he'd call me back. He thought I was going to let it go. A lot of people had thought that about me over the years. I have a quiet way of moving through the world. I don't raise my voice. I don't make scenes. In my family, the way you handled difficulty was carefully and without drama, and I think people sometimes mistook that for weakness. My father never made that mistake, and he had raised me to know the difference between patience and passivity. My cousin's review took 3 weeks. What she found was not complicated, but it was consistent. A pattern of transfers from our joint account to a secondary account my husband had opened 18 months earlier. Not enormous sums. Nothing that would trigger automatic flags, but steady, methodical. 800 here, 1,200 there, always just under the threshold that might catch attention. Over 18 months it added up to just over $46,000. My father's lawyer called it dissipation of marital assets and said the documentation was very clean and very useful. I remember sitting at the kitchen table in the Brampton rental with that report in front of me, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger. I'd moved past the white-hot phase of that somewhere around day 4 in the hospital. What I felt was clarity. The particular Clean clarity of understanding exactly where you stand and exactly what you're going to do about it. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday morning in April. My husband was served at his office in Mississauga. I know this because his assistant, his actual, legitimate assistant, a kind woman named Trudy who had worked there for 12 years, called my father's lawyer's office to confirm receipt. And Trudy, who apparently had her own feelings about recent developments at the firm, added that the expression on his face had been, in her word, illuminating. He called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. His message lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I know because I listened to it twice before forwarding it to my lawyer. He moved through several phases in that time. Confusion, then explanation, then something that was trying to be remorse but kept sliding into self-justification, then a request that we talk in person before things went further. His voice was careful in the way that people's voices get careful when they understand, finally, that the situation is not what they thought it was. He had assumed that because I'd been quiet, I hadn't been paying attention. The divorce proceedings took 7 months. My father's lawyer was thorough and patient, and occasionally frightening to watch in a way I deeply appreciated. The dissipation evidence was entered. The property in Oakville, we had equity in it, was assessed. The pension and investment accounts were inventoried. My husband retained his own lawyer, naturally, and there was a period of offers and counter-offers and discovery requests that I largely let the lawyers handle while I focused on my son and my ankle, and the slow, strange work of reconfiguring my own life. His colleague was not mentioned in the legal proceedings. She didn't need to be. What mattered in the eyes of the Ontario Family Court was the financial picture, and that picture was clear. We settled in November. I won't list the numbers here because they're private, and also because they're not really the point. The point is that my father's methodical, 40-year approach to understanding exactly what you own and what you're owed turned out to be the most important education I'd ever received, and I had absorbed more of it than I'd realized. My husband kept his car. He moved into a condo in Etobicoke. I heard through a mutual friend 6 months later that his relationship with his colleague had lasted approximately 10 weeks past the date he was served with divorce papers. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even particularly satisfied. That kind of thing tends to take care of itself. Our son adjusted better than I expected, which is to say he adjusted the way children adjust when the adults around them are honest with him and steady with him, and don't ask him to carry things that belong to the grown-ups. We told him, together, that his dad and I weren't going to be married anymore, that it wasn't anything he had done, that we both loved him exactly as much as we always had. He cried, and then he asked if he could have a snack, and I thought, yes, that's about right. He lives primarily with me. His dad has him every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. They watch hockey together. My son still cheers for the Leafs with the earnest, punishing commitment of a true Ontarian, and I've decided not to hold that against either of them. My father helped me find a townhouse in Oakville. A different one. A new build. Nothing scorched. He insisted on coming to the walkthrough and spent 45 minutes with the building inspector going over the electrical panel, which I found both touching and completely unsurprising. My mother repainted the living room with me on a Saturday in late September, and we ordered sushi and listened to the CBC, and she didn't ask me how I was feeling every 5 minutes. She just stayed. And sometimes that is the only thing you need from another person. I went back to work in the spring. I'd taken a leave after the fire, which I needed, and I'm at a different firm now, one I like better, doing urban green space projects for the city of Toronto. I go to the office 3 days a week and work from home the other 2, and I pick my son up from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we have dinner together almost every night that he's with me. I have not started dating again. I'm not in a hurry. I've learned something about the value of knowing where you stand before you let someone else into the picture. Last June, my son and I drove to Niagara Falls. I had promised him, in the smoke and the noise and the fear, that we would go back. I don't break promises to my son. We drove down on a Friday afternoon, the 2 of us, windows down because he likes the air. And he talked the whole way about something his friend at school had said that week, and whether orcas were technically dolphins, and what would happen if you could teach a crow to play chess. We stayed at a hotel on the Canadian side. We walked along the parkway in the evening, and the mist came up off the falls and turned everything soft and wet and gray-green. And my son walked right up to the railing and looked down at all that water, and was completely silent for almost a full minute. Then he turned to me and said, "Mom, do you think it ever stops?" I looked at the water, the impossible, relentless amount of it. All that force going over the edge and continuing anyway. Continuing without interruption, falling and then flowing forward into the river below, and eventually out to the lake. And I said, "No, I don't think it does." He thought about that for a moment and then said, "Good," and took my hand. And we stood there watching until the sun went behind the clouds and it started to get cold. That night, after he was asleep in the hotel room, I sat by the window for a while and listened to the falls in the distance. You can't see them from where we were, but you can feel them. A low constant vibration in the air. The sound of something moving that cannot be stopped. And I thought about the woman I had been on that kitchen floor, talking to my son through the ceiling to keep him calm. And I thought about my father in the hospital doorway, with 2 Tim Hortons coffees, and that expression on his face. I thought about what it means to be steady. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Present. Continuing. And in the morning, my son woke up and asked if we could get waffles, and I said yes, and we did, and it was enough. It was in fact more than enough. It was exactly what I had been moving toward, through all of it. The smoke and the floor, and the flowers in the plastic sleeve, and the lawyers and the long, patient, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life that is genuinely mine. And standing in it, finally, I found that I didn't need it to be dramatic to know that it was real.